So there's one question from world literature that everybody's always asking, and that is, who is John Galt? But I will see you your John Galt and raise you one better. I'm still fixated on a much older mystery. Who is Odysseus? All right, our hero at last takes center stage. We've been on this journey, weeks and weeks now on this journey through the Homeric poems. We started with the material before the Iliad and the judgment of Paris that kicked off the Trojan War. Then we went through the Iliad and the story of Achilles' rage and the grand destruction that it wrought upon the Greeks, and then the death of Hector. Now we're deep into Odyssey territory. We talked last week about what was going on back home in Ithaca with Telemachus and Penelope. We talked about the news that reached Telemachus via Menelaus, one of Odysseus' comrades from the Trojan War, the news about Odysseus that he may still be alive after all this time, after all these years. And remember that we're going through this story in chronological order of the narrative itself, which is not the order that the poems go in. I'm trying to tell you the story from start to finish because I think a lot of Homer's audience would have had that template in their minds when they were listening to the poems or later on reading them. And in order to fully get everything we can out of these enormous epics, which have so much in them, the whole world almost is contained in these epics, but to get it all out, you need to know kind of what's going on. So that's the trajectory we've been taking. It's not the trajectory Homer takes, which is a more artful trajectory where different things come kind of out of order. The poet Horace, the later Roman poet Horace, invented this famous phrase to talk about this technique. He said that poets who really know what their subject matter is about begin in medias res. That is, they drop us right into the middle of the action. And sometimes this is taken to mean that things which begin in medias res start in the middle of a scene. And now if somebody says, well, this novel begins in medias res, they'll probably mean that the first chapter opens with a line of dialogue in the middle of a conversation or something like that. But Horace doesn't quite mean that so much as he means find the point in the narrative where you can drop us right into the heart of the matter. And I've been arguing throughout that Homer does that he announces at the beginning of each of these poems what his subject is. The first word of the Iliad is Manus, the story of the rage, and that rage breaks out in Book 1 between Agamemnon and Achilles, and it is resolved in Book 24 when Achilles breaks down in grief for all that he's lost alongside Priam, and the entire conflict is brought into this place of sorrow and suffering. The Odyssey begins with the word aner, that is, andra moi enepe musa, sing to me of the man. So the subject of this poem is the man Odysseus, and what's fascinating and different about the way Homer approaches it is he doesn't bring Odysseus right on stage. We've now spent time in 4 whole books of the poem's 24 books that are about Telemachus and the void, the hole that Odysseus' absence has left behind, which all wars create these power vacuums, these love vacuums in the civilizations that have to go and fight them. So Homer is playing a very polutropos game, a very twisty-turny game, and that's part of the point. It's part of the nature of the story he's trying to tell. I am trying my best to untangle some of those threads and give you the story as it comes, but we are now at last at the main event. And when people think of the Odyssey, and if they know anything about the Odyssey or they've seen any of the popular interpretations of it, my favorite personally being the SpongeBob SquarePants movie, which is in fact based on the Odyssey. But if you've seen anything about the Odyssey, the books you probably know about are actually just books 9 through 11, with a little bit on either side of that maybe to add to the picture and round out the story. But if you think about the Cyclops, if you think about Circe, if you think about Calypso, if you think about even the Lotus Eaters, it's all in this really tight core of the story, and the vast majority of it is told by Odysseus in flashback at the very, very end of his journey. He's reached this place called Phaeacia, which is possibly an invention of Homer's. A lot of this part of the story takes place in a kind of mythical, fairyland. It's not totally clear at all times where on the map Odysseus is, although we know that he's circling around the Mediterranean to get back to Ithaca, in the island on the northwest coast of the mainland of Greece. But Phaeacia is sort of this way station. It's almost like Brigadoon. This later, if you've seen the musical, Brigadoon is the place that vanishes into the mist and only appears once every so often. So you have to decide whether you're going to stay or go. And Phaeacia is this mythical region of almost superhuman navigators. So they're the perfect people for Odysseus at last to meet with, but he lands on their shores bedraggled and alone after all of the stories that the Odyssey is famous for, and it's only in the courts of King Alcinous of the Phaeacians that he ends up telling this whole story to begin with. And this, I think, is an essential part of the poem, a linchpin point of the poem that we have to come to grips with. So we actually have to reckon now with the difference between the story that I'm telling you, the narrative of the sequence of events, and the structure of the story that Homer himself is creating, because he's looping these different narratives back on top of one another, and it's very purposeful that the main journey is not given to us directly by the narrator, as all of the Iliad basically is given to us directly by the narrator, but rather told in the memory of the man himself. And why is that important? Well, because it's in telling the story and finally reckoning with all of his journeys and taking stock of everything he's been through, all the suffering, all the algae, the pains and the griefs, not just of war, but of homecoming and of leaving behind his fallen comrades and of all the years that he's lost with his family. It's in taking stock of all that and telling that story that Odysseus finally starts to become the man who can come home. And so what I want to talk to you about now is the moment when Odysseus begins to tell that story. And I think this is the first moment in the poem when Odysseus truly says, in honesty and in frankness, I am Odysseus. There's a really important and very moving moment when he says that to King Alcinous, who has started to guess who he is. Because when he shows up, he's so wary after all his many journeys and betrayals that he doesn't immediately announce himself as Odysseus, who he knows that his tales of his journeys and legends of his cunning have traveled around the world, so he knows he'll be recognized if he says his name. He doesn't immediately. He's always wary. He's been counseled by Athena, or coached rather by the wisdom that he gets from Athena to keep things back, to play things close to the breast, but in doing so, he's also alienated himself from himself. He's become twisty and turny inside by always telling lies, always having to pretend to be somebody else. And it's now in the moment that he is forced to remember that he starts to tell this story. So what happens is they're at a feast in King Alcinous' hall. The Phaeacians live in a sort of utopia world. In fact, some people say this is one of the first ever, if not the first ever, scenes of utopia, the perfect place. And they play games, they have competitions, just like at the end of the Iliad when they do the sports competitions as part of Patroclus' funeral. Now they're doing it just as pure enjoyment and sport and fun. And then they bring out the singer, because what are you going to do when there's no TV and when the highest art is this poetic song, much like the kind that Homer is spinning? Well, you get Demodocus, the main guy, the marquee event, and he has been blessed by the muses. Much as the legend has it, Homer was blind, Demodocus is blind, and Homer says that the goddess gave him good and bad. That is, gave the gift of poetic sight but took away physical vision. And Demodocus sings a bunch of stories, but it's Odysseus actually who asks for the story of the Trojan horse. This is the one cameo of the Trojan horse that really takes center stage in the Odyssey. As I've said, the event itself, where the Trojan horse sneaks into the walls and the Greeks hide in this big wooden horse, that is skipped over in between the Odyssey, or the Iliad rather, in the Odyssey, and it was covered by a different epic, not by Homer, the Iliou-Persis. But now we get it, again, sort of mentioned, not even in flashback, but in song. So already we're being cued into the fact that after the events of the Iliad, this situation emerged where trickery and deceit and hiding was how the war was finally won, and that knot that was tangled then in Odysseus, who came up with the brilliant stratagem of hiding in the horse, that knot that began to be tangled was woven tighter and tighter until he couldn't even know himself anymore, which is a hugely relatable situation. If you've ever gotten caught up in a lie, either out of necessity for survival like Odysseus, or just in regular life because you were trying to cover up something you did or anything like that, if you've ever been lying about yourself, you know how mysteriously the lie can enter its way into your own soul, and the stories you're telling other people, the lies and the false stories that you're telling other people about who you are, start to become stories that you tell about yourself until you can't pick apart anymore who you really are, who you originally were before all of this deception, and who you actually are or long to be. And Odysseus is deep, deep within that maze in himself. It's an extraordinarily psychological story when you think about the fact that this is thousands of years before Freud, when we thought we figured out all this stuff about the subconscious. No, Odysseus is right in there, woven up, tangled in his own knot of lies, and something has to cut through it. And I don't think he expects that what cuts through it will be the song that he asks for, because he's being, again, sly and underhanded by asking for the story of the Trojan horse, which he knows he's the main event of. But he doesn't reckon with the fact that when he's told his own story, he will suddenly see himself for the first time. And that's, in fact, what happens. So the story goes on past the Trojan War and into, we are led, I think, to suppose, into the griefs and the homecoming that follows. And I've translated the passage. This is actually at the end of book 8. So before Odysseus starts telling his own story, we get this extraordinarily striking simile. Homer's famous for his similes. He's always comparing this situation with that situation, so on and so forth. And this is one of a few in which he compares men of war to female victims of war, which is a key to the whole picture, the whole tragic picture of Homer's worldview, because he has, of course, this glorious vision of warriors that is very much alive. He's not discounting or downplaying that, but he also is deeply aware of the costs of war, the psychological toll of war, for example, in the case of Achilles, but also the material, physical cost of war, which is often one that paid by the women afterward. Hector, remember, wishes that he can die before he has to see all the terrible things that are going to happen to Andromache, his wife, afterward. So yes, soldiers die. Yes, they risk their lives. Yes, in fact, they win glory. Yes, they suffer psychological torment. But the counterpart, the female flip side to that, is the female suffering and loss and the pain and the subjection. And those two things are distinct because they're male and female, but they're also for Homer intertwined like a kind of yin-yang symbol. And we get that here when Odysseus hears his own song. So I'm going to give you my translation now of this passage near the end of book 8, and this is when Alcinous really starts to suspect. It's possible he suspects before that, but Homer doesn't tell us so. This is when we know that he really gets clued in. All this, that is the whole story of the Troy and its aftermath, all this the world-renowned singer sang, and then Odysseus wept. The tears seeped down under his eyelids and wet his cheeks, like a woman who wails as she hurls herself down by her cherished husband, dead on the ground at the gates of his city, in front of his people, straining to ward off the deadly day from his home and his children. This sounds exactly like Hector. Hector's not mentioned, but it sounds just like Hector and Andromache, straining to ward off the deadly day from his home and his children. She, when she sees him choking and rasping his dying breath, drapes her own body around his and shrieks in pain, while behind her, bludgeoning her on the back and across the shoulders with spears, they come to drag her away into bondage, labor, and grief. Her cheeks are ravaged and worn with surpassing, heart-wrenching pain. So Odysseus, under his brow, poured down pitiable tears. He managed to hide them from everyone else as he shed them except Alcinous. He took notice, and took it to heart, sitting there right beside him and hearing his heavy groans. That goes hard, man. There's so much literary brilliance in this. You see why I say these poems contain everything, because this is just a passing moment to get us to the next plot point, and yet this picture is so finely drawn. It's like it's in miniature. The words, especially in Greek, that Homer uses for how the wife falls to the ground over the corpse of her dying husband, it's almost impossible to get in English. I had a hard time with this part of the translation because it's like she's draping her. I think I used the word draping. It's like she's draping herself around the body as it dies. Amphipessusa, falling. Amphi means around, so she's falling around him, draping his body. You can imagine her sort of slumped and weeping as she's being buffeted by the blows of the enemy. And man, I translated exactly as it shows up in the text when Homer begins a new line with, they come to drag her away. We get that it's the enemy battle foe that is coming in to take her away, but it's so ominous the way that they sort of creep up behind her. And then again, we get this another verb about sort of kumene. It's like she's pouring her body onto the body of her dead husband. And that, of course, is how Odysseus is pouring his tears down his cheeks, and he can't let anyone see, but all of this is coming out now, and the dam has burst. And what's the other component of this? It's Alcinous. Alcinous is one of the great slept-on chads of this entire poem, because he is the buddy that sits and notices and says, hey, open up, man. Like, enough is enough, right? And by calling his bluff so gently, Alcinous invites him into this story, which is going to be how Odysseus begins to recognize himself again. There's something so profound here, leaving aside now the literary elements of this, that we really have to dwell with for a moment, because it's easy to miss, and it's easy to think of it just as a rip-roaring adventure story, which of course it is. But I want to stress to you the idea that Odysseus is coming back to himself here in memory, in telling his own story in retrospect. Why is that important? Well, of course, straight up, it's important for Homer. Homer's project is to give you the story version. And in some sense, Odysseus here, never mind Demodocus, Odysseus here is in some sense in the role of Homer by arranging this story for us now, and not simply telling us a sequence of events, but giving it through a lens, through a perspective, shaping it in his own mind and telling it as he lived it. And that in itself is what it means for him to know himself, because there is a deep and mysterious connection between memory and the self. And if you think about this, this is true even on the most granular possible level. Without memory, there wouldn't be a self. You wouldn't be you if you couldn't remember some element of your past experience. Doesn't have to be a lot, doesn't have to be everything, and you're still you even if you only have the potential to remember. You're still you if you're asleep, you're still you if you have Alzheimer's, if you've lost that, just by being a being that can remember in potentiality, as the philosophers might say. That's what makes you you. And I want to start by building this idea up from its very small, granular foundations. Just think about the most basic experience you have, the experience, say, of hearing birdsong outside your window. You're hearing a sound. We know, Homer didn't know in precisely this way, but we know that hearing a sound is triggered or correlated with a physical impact on your eardrums, and it's a vibration. That is the motion of a sound wave across time. And if you take a snapshot of you at any one instant, freezing time for a second, halfway through the birdsong, there is no motion in that snapshot. It's just an instant. And if every instant were disconnected from one another and there were no relation between the instants, it would just be a bunch of different positions of your eardrum and a bunch of different air particles in various positions and so on and so forth. It would be, in other words, a purely quantitative picture of you and of the world, just particles in certain positions. But if you then took that snapshot and you put it next to the next instant, then if you have those two things connected to one another, the motion of the eardrum has a trajectory. It goes from one position to another. And I know I'm kind of wigging out about this a little bit, but it's really important. The motion is in time, is across time. And the pattern of motion takes place in the joining of a bunch of successive instants. In fact, an infinite number of infinitely small instants, as in calculus, joined together to make the vibration that is sound or is the physical correlate of sound. And unless you or somebody can string those instants together, there is no sound to speak of. There's only a bunch of disjointed instants. That's why if there's a bunch of disjointed experiences of consciousness, let's say in the mind of a newt, let's imagine, I don't know anything about how newts actually think, but let's imagine that newts don't have memory or can't connect memory. There's not really a selfhood or a full person there. In The Three-Body Problem, a novel I really love, a modern science fiction novel, there's a scene at the beginning of book 2 that takes place from the perspective of an ant. And the ant can only store little tiny bits of memory, and so its personality, if you can call it that, isn't really fully formed in the way that ours is, because we create our experience, or the soul creates our experience by binding instants together. And that's memory in its tiniest particles. That's the atoms of memory, is stringing moment and moment together. You have to be able to perceive patterns, even in order to be seeing and hearing things. Any kind of physical perception even requires joining disparate things together. And in order to join disparate things together, you have to have a vessel, a container that holds them all in place. So now broaden this out, because that's only the tiniest material building block of what I'm talking about. Think next of the bird song itself, or think of a human song. Think of the song that Homer's singing, or think of Sabrina Carpenter. I don't care. Think about any music. And think about what it is for there to be music. At any given moment, there's only one tone. There's, let's say, the pitch, ha, right? That's not a song. That's, even if you just froze, the moment of song, which is not only one instantaneous moment, but let's say it lasts for a second. That's not a song. Now I'm going to go, happy birth. Now there's the beginnings of a pattern, right? And as the time extends from beat to beat in the song is bound together in the memory. All of these things are linked together in the vessel of memory, which is the holding place of the soul. Augustine, in Confessions, his autobiography, and his spiritual autobiography, talks about this in book 10. It's one of the most mysterious passages in literature from this period, because of the way it seems to prefigure all sorts of things about quantum physics and relativity theory, that Augustine is reckoning with the impossibility of fully knowing the self, because we can only contain so much within our memory. And he ultimately believes that's why you have to confess to God, because it's God whose mind is able to contain the wholeness of you and your complete self. So Augustine is wrestling with some of the exact same problems that Homer is wrestling with in a totally different mode. That is, how can we ever know ourselves? And here's what he says, book 10, chapter 13. Everything which enters into the soul by its own avenue, that is all the sense perceptions, sound, sight, color, they come in by their own avenues. They are distinctly and under general heads laid up in the soul. Light and all colors and forms of bodies by the eyes, sounds of all kinds by the ears, all smells by the passage of the nostrils, all flavors by that of the mouth. So using the five senses, they have their own entry points and routes into our consciousness, into the soul. And by the sensation of the whole body, because we have this consciousness that links the whole body together in space and time, by the whole body is brought in what is hard or soft or cold, smooth or rough or heavy or light, whether external or internal to the body. All these does that great receptacle of memory, with its many and indescribable departments, receive, to be recalled and brought forth when required. Each entering by its own door is hid up in it. Now, bear that in mind. Think about the fact that your memory is what makes you whole as a consciousness. Never mind as a personality with all your particular traits and attributes, but just as an entity or a soul yourself, you are tied together by memory. It's in memory, too, that stories emerge. And it's in stories that we know not just the raw data of what happens to us or the things we encounter in the world, but the shape and the pattern that those encounters have for us. And that's where the pattern of you, who you are, starts to imprint itself onto that raw material of experience. It's like it shapes and molds it. We all know that in our memories, we sometimes even exaggerate or distort or remold things that happened. And that can be a problem when we misremember things, when we don't think factually. And there are all sorts of studies showing how people, if they're focused on one thing, they don't remember something way more intense. If you've ever seen the thing where you're asked to focus on people playing basketball and really zero in on how many times they pass the ball, and then you play the tape back and this guy wearing a giant gorilla suit has been walking past and you didn't even notice, that doesn't get stored in your memory. So there's all sorts of things that show that where we're paying attention, how we personally are investing our will, our desire, shapes the way that our memory lands for us. And that, of course, can be a distorting factor or a problem, but it can also be a revelatory factor about what is important and what kind of story we are living through. And it's through telling those stories that we come to know ourselves. This is something that in Out of the Silent Planet, C.S. Lewis talks about. This is the first of the 3 novels in the space trilogy. And it's Hyoi, who is one of the kind of otter beings in Malacandra, which is Mars. They're the poet people. They are the people of art. And the races on Mars in Malacandra are sort of divided into the 3 parts of the soul. So there are the craftsman workers who are like the body, and there are the intellectual agents who are the keepers of all knowledge. And then there are the Hyoi, who are sort of the spirit or the thumos, and they have this poetic tradition. So they know things sort of intuitively. And it's not quite Plato's 3 parts of the soul, but it is as if the different elements of humanity have been divided and arrayed into 3 different species in this book. And Hyoi is telling him about how within their innocent people, they haven't fallen. So they have this innocence and this natural worship of God that isn't as sophisticated intellectually, but comes out of their hearts. In that innocence, they never have problems of things like overindulgence. And Ransom, the hero, says, how can that possibly be? He says, well, we enjoy something, and then we enjoy it in the memory. And he says that's the moment of enjoyment is only the first part of a thing. It's only the seed of a reality. It's not the whole reality. It's the way that seed grows in the soul and in memory that it really becomes what it is. So in relationship between you, the receptacle that is you, and the outside world which plants these seeds, that's where true reality comes into being. So Hyoi says to Ransom, when you and I met, the meeting was over very shortly. It was nothing. That's like that instant when the sound wave hits your ear with no time extension. That moment of meeting is itself without significance. Now it is growing something as we remember it, but still we know very little about it. What it will be when I remember it as I lie down to die, what it makes in me all my days till then, that is the real meeting. The other is only the beginning of it. That's what I'm talking about in knowing yourself in stories. You are, when you tell a story, when you say that you were over the moon about something, when you exaggerate, when you speak metaphorically, even when you misremember something in a significant way, like you remember that somebody was there at a crucial time in your life, and then suddenly you realize, no, that person had already died, so he can't have been there. Why do I feel like he was there? That's your memory expressing something about the nature of the experience that isn't bound up in the raw material data. And again, you have to be careful to distinguish between these two things. It's not like that means the person was physically there in the same way that the people who were alive were there. But if you're talking about your son's birthday and you say, and my mom was there. Wait, no, my mom had already died. There's something there about your experience that you are expressing, that your memory is telling you about that moment. And those of us that believe in the afterlife and in heaven may in fact say that there is some real presence that you're sensing and uncovering in your memory. All these things, the way we tell our stories, even when we get them factually wrong, can be significant about who we are and what is actually going on in the encounter between us and the world. This is, I think, one reason why Hegel very famously says that the owl of Athena flies at dusk. This is the German philosopher Hegel, and his preface to the Philosophy of the Right has this famous saying. Of course, he was German, so he said it all German-like. He said, "Die Eule der Minerva beginnt erst mit der einbrechenden Dämmerung ihren Flug." The owl of Minerva begins first with the breaking in of dusk, Dämmerung. That's the same word where we get Götterdämmerung, the twilight of the gods. When twilight first begins, then the owl of Minerva launches on her flight. That he can say that because this function of memory, this looking back, this retrospective act of storytelling is actually the consummation of human knowledge and wisdom. And like all human faculties, it has to be cultivated. It can err, we can err, and we can make mistakes. But also like all human faculties, because we can err, we can also get things right. And we can get things right in more than just the material way. And we have to in order to take full stock and account of the real actual phenomena of our experience. This isn't some pseudoscientific mumbo-jumbo. This is even in the bare bones of material perception. This is true. We need to incorporate memory and storytelling to get at the real truth. And what I love in the passage from C.S. Lewis is what Hioy says last. He says, "You say you have poets in your world. Do they not teach you this?" And of course, Ransom is coming from this hyper-scientistic age that has dissociated itself or alienated itself from the poetic impulse and the storytelling impulse. And that's why he finds this so foreign and indeed literally alien. But as he says, yes, our poets did try. I think Augustine tries to teach us this. Homer teaches us this. This is one of Homer's most profound metaphysical teachings, even though it doesn't come across that way, even though it's done so subtly and artfully and in the midst of a rip-roaring story and an engaging myth and narrative. Homer is showing us this in this moment between Odysseus and Alcinous, and we can see that in what happens next. So now I'm going to read for you just a bit of the speech with which Odysseus launches into his tale, the part of the poem that everybody remembers is about to start in Book 9, and Odysseus launches into it thusly. He's been talking about how he doesn't blame the singer for singing about what he has suffered, but that he now has to reveal he can't hold it in any longer, that he himself is one of the sufferers. And he says, oh man, it breaks my heart. He says, "What should I tell you first then? And what should I tell you last? Where do I even start?" And what an amazing question, given everything we've just been saying about Homer's own poetic technique, right? This is Odysseus standing in for Homer. Where do I begin? How do I start this story with so many twists and turns? What should I tell you first then? And what should I tell you last? The gods from their seat on high have dealt me so many sorrows. But now at the first, I will tell you my name, so that everyone here can know it too. I am here on the run from the day of death, a stranger among you. The home where I live is a long way off. I am Odysseus, son of Laertes. For all my tricks, I'm a going concern among men, and my fame has made it to heaven. Boy, okay, where to begin? So the opening line, it's not the opening line of the speech, but when he starts to tell his story is so perfect and such a perfect mirror, of course, of everything Homer is doing. And if you blink, you'll miss it, but it's right there. This is what you cannot tell me this poem was written by multiple people. This is one guy, a genius, of course, an inspired genius, but this is one guy. Nun donoma proton muthesomai. That proton first is doing a lot of interesting double work there. First, I will tell you my name. In other words, I will begin the story by telling you my name. I will start from who I am. So just as Homer says, Andra moi enipe musa, I will start from the man, is I will begin from who I am. But I think also he's saying, I will now tell you my name for the first time. I haven't yet told you, Phaeacians, who I am. And maybe even I will now say for the first time and speak aloud truly and without deceit, without any kind of deflection or subterfuge. I will now for the first time tell you my name, who I am. The concept of the name in the ancient world is not just about the sounds that you say, it's about your identity. It's bound up with the essence of who you are. So now at the first, I will tell you my name so that you too can know it. We know ourselves in being known, right? So he's speaking his own story, reckoning with it, coming to know himself by explaining it to other people. And in that relationship, in the space between them, he is going to come to be known. I've been fleeing from the day of death, which is that stock phrase that comes up again and again, Nela es Hamar, or Nela es Amar, which is what Hector was trying to beat back and what the man in the simile died trying to fight off. And so now Odysseus is himself fleeing from that day of death. A stranger among you, I live a long way off. I am Odysseus. And you can just hear his burden almost falling off of him when he says that. I am Odysseus, son of Laertes. For all my tricks, I'm a going concern. So I did a little double entendre in this translation. I think it's in the Greek, and if my reading of this moment is right, he's saying pasi doloisen anthropoisi melo. That is, I am a concern among men. I am known about among men for all of my tricks. And on the one hand, of course, that means that everybody knows him. On the other hand, it means that nobody knows him. Because if you're known for deceit, then how can you ever be known? And this is the position of Odysseus, but in some sense, it's the position of all of us. If we're always trying to get ourselves across, but never quite making it, and if there's something within that even we can't get a handle on, then how can we ever really be known? And the next line, or the next half line, kaimeo kleos uranon hike, is a callback to the Iliad, because kleos is the thing that all the soldiers fight for in the Iliad. But Homer is big enough to know that even that winning fame comes with its own cost, because the fame takes on its own shape and becomes a kind of dolos unto itself, a kind of trick unto itself. And this is going to, at long last, be Odysseus' effort to unweave that knot and reveal himself. Andra moi enepemusa, muse, tell me, who is this man? You need something divine from outside to explain the man of many twists and turns, to unknot your own identity and come to know you. And that's what Odysseus is doing through the divine power of song and memory in this moment. It gives me chills, man. I love this moment. And now he's going to embark on it. And what's so brilliant is that it begins, really, the story there's a few episodes that I'll briefly touch on after he leaves Troy. But the first episode that probably everybody remembers is the episode of the Cyclops. And I'll talk more about it next week, but the Cyclops is famous because it's in that moment that Odysseus calls himself nobody. So he begins his tale at his moment maybe of greatest alienation from himself, when even revealing himself is identifying himself with nobody and dooming himself to more and more wanderings. It's really powerful and profound, and we're going to now embark upon this story. There are so many of these episodes that I can't talk with you through all of them, or this would take the rest of the year, which, might be fun. But I want to get to some other poems too after this, and we have to watch the movie that's coming out at the end of the year. So I do want us to be ready for that movie when it comes out. But now I just want to toss your way some cool online resources that I think can be helpful if you're coming to grips with this poem, because it's really hard to visualize. It's meant to be hard to visualize. Some of it is impossible to really pin down or understand. But of course, people have been making the attempt for a very long time, ever since basically the poem was first composed. And there are some great maps online. And boy, do I love a map. Men only want one thing, and it's maps. I really think that maps are if you're a history nerd, to look at a map of the Persian Empire expanding over time, or the different empires of the Near East, is just, there's something incredibly satisfying about it. I think it comes back to that thing I was talking about last week about the Christomathia, the desire for learning. And that's, I joke about men only want one thing, but that's not a sex-limited thing. There's something just inherently human in the satisfaction of seeing it all laid out in front of you. And there's a few of them online. One of them is from UPenn. And I'll drop a link to it. If you go to the description of this episode, there will be a bunch of links, including this link to UPenn's interactive map. And this website in general is really great. It's not just for Homer. There's tabs for Hesiod and other authors too. And there's an image itself, which the image is not that great. I'm going to tell you about a better image in just a second. But the cool thing is that you can click through the different locations and see the journey take shape as it goes, because there's lots of switchbacks in the journey and twists and turns. Of course, makes sense, right? Appropriate, since it's all polytropos. But that can make it hard, even if somebody draws the line of it for you. You kind of want to watch it animated. So you can do that with the UPenn map. But the really killer, the clutch map, in terms of its visuals, is by this guy, Simon Nechev, whom you guys should watch out for, because he's great. Anytime he makes a map, I'm there. I'm a Nechev junkie. It's like anytime he puts one out, it's like, wake up, babe, new Nechev map just dropped. So he draws these beautiful maps, which are posted mainly on the World History Encyclopedia. Itself a really great resource. They get a bunch of different scholars, but Nechev's maps are awesome, and they are, I believe, public domain with attribution. So if you want to use them and share them around, don't quote me on this. Make sure this is right, because on the internet it's hard to know. But I'm pretty sure that he basically offers this to people as long as you quote him. So I will link to that too, where you can find it in the show notes. But I'll just use the map here to talk you through the episodes up to the Cyclops, because that's what I want to deal with next time. And actually, there's one other moment before the Cyclops that's pretty famous, and we should get to that too. But we start in Troy, right? Of course, on his way off, and that's where Odysseus begins his story. He leaves with 12 ships, and this is another cool thing about Nechev's map, is that it keeps track of the attrition rate in the journey, which is a major element of the horror of the story. We remember all the fun adventures, but there's a lot of gore and tragedy, and Odysseus is stripped of his comrades. And that, I think, is a really insightful thing that Homer is saying about coming home from war. POWs still talk about this, and veterans still talk about this, that even despite the fact that war is hell, when you return, you're suddenly let loose from this tight-knit phalanx, this band of brothers. And if you don't have another band of brothers and a new civilization, a society waiting to accept you and take you in and make you a part of it, then it's a terrible loss. And it's a terrible loss anyway, because that camaraderie is really hard to replicate, and it's a different form. The camaraderie of battle is just of a different caliber and species than civilized life and integration into family life. And to be stripped of that, even if your buddies don't die, to be stripped of that is a very traumatic and painful experience for soldiers coming home. So that is, I think, embodied in the story of Odysseus as his comrades are lost. And Nechev keeps track of that. He says he leaves with 12 ships worth of men. Because remember, he's the king of Ithaca. He's got all these troops that he contributed to the war effort. And they all of them that have survived come back with him. They first make land at Ismarus, where they rape, kill, pillage, and burn. I mean, the interesting thing about it is that they start off kind of as a war party, or even as brigands or pirates. This is what they set out to do, in some sense, is to conquer and win booty and plunder. And they also need supplies. So they have this battle with the Cicones. They kidnap the wives of the Cicones. This is the crew does this. And 76 of them are killed in that skirmish. So 76 men down. On they go. They make land again at Cape Malea, and this is where the mishaps really begin. So they start to get blown off course. There's 10 days worth of storms, and that is how they end up at the it's not an island, it's the land of the Lotus Eaters, the Lotophagoi, those who eat the lotus. And that's the one that I said is, if there's anything besides the Cyclops that we really remember from this earliest point is probably the Lotus Eaters. And that too is really significant given everything I've just been saying, right? Because memory, right? Memory is what makes you who you are. Memory is how your self comes into shape. What do the Lotus Eaters do? They forget. When you eat a lotus, you forget that you ever had a homeland, that you ever need to go back. And Odysseus has to drag his comrades away from this. But I think the encounter, the touch with forgetfulness is an important dimension, because Odysseus has a lot of things to hold in his memory, and also a lot of things he has to now leave behind. The carnage of war, the suffering of his comrades and that band of brothers. And it's on the way out of the land of the Lotus Eaters that he ends up in the world of the Cyclops. Men, he says, who are sort of lawless, almost half brutes, but giant and famously with one eye. We're going to talk about what happens there next week. But I want to toss one other resource at you because it's just too good not to mention, and I've only recently come into awareness of it. And that is this concept album called Epic, E-P-I-C, and I think it's capital E, capital P, lowercase I, big C. I will also drop the link to this in the show. It's a giant adaptation of, at this point, all Homeric poetry, plus some of the extra stuff. It's almost like a score to everything I've been telling you about on the show all this time. This thing, oh man, I'm always wary when you get a modern adaptation of Greek myths and anything really from antiquity, because as I discussed when we talked about the movie Troy, there's a lot of stuff in Greek myths that is not very fitting for modern sensibilities, and we're sort of prudish about even allowing the ancients to be the ancients. So there's a lot of angst that comes up. My hackles get raised. I get a little triggered, and I have some PTSD whenever I hear that somebody's making a new adaptation. There's a show right now on Netflix called Chaos that is a hyper-modern and totally loose rendering of some Greek myths. I've only watched the first episode, but I'm feeling a little dicey about it. So when I first saw this, I was like, I don't know, how's this going to go? Oh, you guys, I am so obsessed with this thing. I can't guarantee, it's a huge sprawling work, so I can't rubber stamp and guarantee that everything in there is exactly as it is in the Homeric poems. It's perfectly scholarly accurate down to the letter. But that's never been my concern, because the Greeks loved to tell and retell these stories too. And so far as I can tell, Rivera Herons, if that's how you say his name, is really true to the spirit of the stories and gets all of these little details in, all these throwaway lines that if you haven't been listening to Young Heretics and or reading Homer, you might not catch them. But now that you have, you'll be able to pick up on that reference. One of the gifs that people throw at me most online is, I think it's Captain America saying, I understood that reference. And if Young Heretics give you nothing else, it's that you will be able to understand the references in things like Epic, and it's so fun. It's like a kind of a pop rock sort of vibe, but Rivera Herons, I think, does a lot of the singing himself. He's got a terrific voice, but he also brings in other singers, and the music is so rockin'. The part about the Trojan horse is great. The Underworld song is amazing. If you haven't checked this out already, take a look. I of course, I'm such an old, and I'm so out of touch that I assumed I found this thing, like, wow, nobody else seems to know about this. And then, of course, I looked this guy up. He's got like 222,000 followers on Instagram. So I'm sure he doesn't need me to shout him out. But hey, Jorge, if you're listening, kudos, hats off to you, man. Great, great work. And I would say if you're looking to familiarize yourself with the trajectory of some of this stuff, look at these maps, pour yourself a drink, look at some maps, listen to Epic. It's a grand old time. Okay. I'm going to hit pause there for a bit because I want to give the Cyclops his due, and I'm going to chunk up these journeys into a few different episodes, starting with the Cyclops next week. Don't miss it. Tune in next time. I will see you there. But for now, let me take a mailbag question. So mailbag questions come to me on Substack, a platform I love more and more with every passing week. If you're not on Substack, you are missing out. Come check out rejoiceevermore.substack.com, where I do my weekly Friday essays, just write stuff about what's on my mind, usually connected to something that's going on. They're called newsletters because they are connected to things. Like last time I did a review of Matt Walsh's Am I Racist?, which is the movie that is absolutely crushing it at the box office, smashing a lot of records and doing way, way better than most documentaries do. Of course, nobody's going to give you a mainstream review of it in the New York Times. They're doing their best to ignore it, but I wrote a review of it, so don't read the New York Times. Read my Substack, rejoiceevermore.substack.com. Also check out my joint Substack with my dad, The New Jerusalem, which is thenewjerusalem.substack.com. That's a series of letters between the two of us where we talk about faith in the modern era, what it looks like, how to do it without either dissolving into cringe and fantasy talk or becoming jaded and materialist and succumbing to the diseases of the modern age. I think we've been really getting somewhere in the conversation, which is so exciting when you don't know where you're going to end up with a project and then something evolves and develops between you. That's always cool. So sign up over there, thenewjerusalem.substack.com. But for our purposes, the most important thing is when you sign up for Rejoice Evermore, you can email me or DM me and ask me questions. And that's the easiest way to get a question in the mailbag, because otherwise it's not totally possible that I will see. It's totally possible that I will not see it, I should say. This week's question is from an OG Young Heretics listener who has now come back to the fold. I think Joe was gone for a while, had interested in other things. That's okay. I won't hold it against you, Joe. Welcome home. And he has a question that I think would be really fun, especially now that we're talking about singing and music and song. Joe is asking me about vocal training. He says, I think people would enjoy this. Do you have a workout routine for your voice? Not looking to mimic, but to sound more Chad in my own voice and command intensity. I'm really glad that you asked this question, because this is one of those things that almost nobody, it's kind of a specialized branch of knowledge. It's called vocal production. And if you take singing lessons, you will get some version of vocal production. But there's literally no one alive for whom these tips aren't helpful. And we just don't teach it. Like it's sort of like home economics. Like, why wouldn't you teach people how to balance a checkbook? Why wouldn't you teach people how to speak in the way that is not only most Chad, that sounds rich and deep and full, but also most healthy and most comfortable and natural for your voice? Everybody's got a voice, man. And it always behooves you to learn how to use it, because that will make you also more natural and relaxed and at ease in other sorts of situations. If you struggle with social situations, and I do, honestly, or did for a long time, I think what you would call an introverted extrovert or an extroverted introvert. I can't remember how that works, but in other words, I'm a guy who's very comfortable alone and can be thrown for a loop by the back and forth of social situations. But if you're able to relax into yourself and forget about self-consciousness, that's a big, big cheat code for being easygoing with people and getting to know people, which is one of the great joys of life. So you want to get past that obstacle. And vocal training has actually genuinely been really helpful for me in that. Plus, it's helpful if you're trying to get stuff done. Your voice is your tool for communicating to people, convincing people, persuading, inviting, all these things that we do all the time. Nobody wouldn't benefit from this kind of thing. And yet we just don't, these are just things you wouldn't know unless somebody told you. So I'm going to tell you now. And this is based on not being really, I'm not an expert in this, but I've done a lot of singing in my life and did theater in school and obviously podcast. And when you podcast, you have to talk for a long time. And that's one of the first things I learned is there's just a lot of space where you are saying things and I've got a lot to say and I get excited and I go on these tangents and I don't want to be thinking in that moment about whether or not I sound good vocally or whether I'm getting all sort of squeaky or whatever. And so the way to do that is just to practice and to train. Like anything else, you have to practice and train. And then you have to get to a point where you don't think about it anymore. So what I'm going to say to you now is a bunch of stuff that's going to sound like a million things to think about. And it's just like when you're training your, say, backhand in tennis. If you've ever played tennis and you've gone out with a tennis coach, he'll be like, okay, so you need to rotate your wrist about 42 degrees, and then you need to take half a second more before you swing. And you're like, how in the hell am I ever going to keep all of this in my head? And the answer is you're not. You're going to do each portion of it a million times or one time every day for a long time. And then you're going to get the reps in, and finally it's going to build its way into your muscle memory. And that's what's going to happen with your voice if you train it and work on it. I'm going to speak from a male perspective. Men and women have different instruments, different apparatus for speaking, but a lot of this is going to stay the same for women too. So if you're, for the ladies listening, this is not only for the fellas, this can help you too. For everybody, your voice is an instrument, and it's an instrument made out of your body. It's a physical activity just like a backhand in tennis. And it's actually exactly like a backhand because if you think about a backhand, it's not a particular muscle, right? You go to the gym, you want to target a particular muscle. You've got an object or a part of your body that you're working out. But a backhand isn't a part of your body. It's something that your whole body does. It's a way of arranging and moving your body and a kind of mechanical set of arrangements that you get deep into your muscle memory so that you don't have to think about it anymore. That's what your voice is. You are built kind of like a guitar or an instrument, which, again, if you ask where is the note C sharp on a guitar, you've asked the wrong question because you can play C sharp on various strings in a guitar in various ways by manipulating all the different parts. There's no physical object. We say that there's an E string and a G string, but that's just what the string plays if you play it without pressing down on any of the frets. And even then, it's not just the string, but the sound box and everything else that's working. The fretboard, everything is at play. Even the fact that you're not pressing the fretboard is influencing that. Your voice is exactly the same way. It really should go from the tip of your toes up to the top of your head, but there are three parts of it that I want to really drive home to you, three component parts of your voice, kind of like in the guitar, you have the sound box and the string and the fretboard. In the human instrument, you have the breath, you have the voice box, and then you have what's called the resonators, which are some of the weirdest and hardest things to wrap your head around if you've never thought about this stuff at all. But little anatomy lesson, you breathe with your diaphragm. It's a muscle underneath your lungs, and basically what it does is it expands and contracts the lungs. And if you think about like a balloon or a bag, right, and you open it up, the air, nature abhors a vacuum, the air moves in as you open up more space and volume. That's what the diaphragm does. When you take a breath in, it allows the lungs to expand. And this can be counterintuitive at first because if you think about taking a deep breath, that sounds very active. It sounds very muscular. It sounds like you have to force that. And people will push out their bellies and they'll maybe raise up their shoulders and they go, that's an example of a stressed out breath. And that ain't going to help you at all in any context, whether you're trying to ask a girl out or trying to do a podcast or whatever. That's not how you're designed to breathe. And there is a God, so you are designed, right? This is actually a matter of minute construction. Don't get in the way. That's the main point. So a breath is an act of relaxation. It's an act of letting go. And all you got to do is just think of your gut, like the real base of your belly, just expanding outward as you relax. And you will start to feel, you can almost feel your diaphragm in the way that there are certain muscles you can't instantly feel, but if you learn, I think of it like learning to expand your toes. If you try to expand your toes, you'll start to feel that there are muscles in between your toes and in your toes that allow you to do that. Similarly, you'll start to feel that there's this muscle in your gut that enables your breath to just come way, way open and out. That's the first thing, is literally just learning how to breathe. Sounds simple, it's the most important thing because the breath is the air, of course, is what's doing the vibrating. In any instrument like your voice, the air is the most important thing, so you need to get as much of it as you can and you need to get it in the most natural and relaxed way. When you do that, you will start to notice naturally that the rest of your body is going to chill out a little bit too. And this is part of why it's so helpful for social situations, is it's a way of regulating your mood. Your body and your soul are connected. You're going to physically relax. And as you let one part go, the rest is going to want to follow. So you got to let it. Your shoulders are going to want to drop. Actually, just the opposite of what you think. When you take a deep breath and your shoulders got it way tight, that's the opposite of what you want. You let the diaphragm relax, your shoulders will relax. Maybe you can start to feel your throat relax. And you can just do this exercise of just breathing way, way in, letting your diaphragm expand as much as you can, and then just hissing out. Maybe do that for 5 breaths or something. Just take a deep, deep breath in and then just let it out with a hiss. And as you hiss, just chill, man. Bro, chill is like the best advice I can give for speaking or singing. Next thing that's going to happen as you do that is you're going to feel the muscles in your throat start to relax. And this is where we get to the voice box, or the larynx, as it is called by us Poindexters. For men, and this is different for men slightly than for women, your larynx, your voice box, is where your Adam's apple is. And actually, your Adam's apple is formed when those vocal folds, they're called, that make the sounds, and you don't have to worry about controlling them. They're going to do their own thing. But the vocal folds that make the air vibrate start to thicken and harden. It's one of the effects of testosterone. It's one of the reasons why female to male transgender people can often pass better, is because testosterone will do this to you no matter what age you are. But naturally, when you go through puberty, your vocal folds will thicken and harden, and this will lower the voice, and that produces your Adam's apple. And so where your Adam's apple sits is actually a really great gauge of how you're doing. What you don't want to do is force it down. And this is something that guys do all the time when they're trying to sound really manly. And of course, this is the worst way to make a truly masculine sound, because it's going to tighten you up and constrict you. And more often than not, it just makes you sound like a weirdo. So instead, all you have to do is relax, and you will notice that your larynx, your Adam's apple, falls naturally. Don't push it any further than it wants to go. Just let it fall. And then once again, get out of the way, bro. Like, you are an instrument designed by God. You ain't going to do better than him. Get out of his way and just let that larynx relax and let it sit naturally where it wants to. You will notice, uttered a sound yet, right? This is all about preparation, and basically it's all about positioning, relaxing, getting out of the way. The last thing you have to learn how to do, and this is maybe the weirdest part, is you have to learn how to send the air without tightening up, how to breathe that air out through your throat and into your resonators. Resonators are just a fancy name for cavities in your body. Gross, but also kind of cool. So from your chest on up to your head and your sinuses, if you think about when you like snort or when you have mucus, that's up in your sinuses. And it's one reason why being sick is bad for singing, is because it gets in the way of these holes, these open spaces that are there for a bunch of reasons, but partly because they enable the air to resonate and to produce the specific profile of overtones that makes your voice. And that's more acoustics than we need to get into, but basically this shape inside of you, this open space inside of you, is what makes your voice your voice. You don't have to do anything to make it happen. It's literally part of your body. It's the way you're shaped. It's like the shape of your toes. That means that everybody's voice is going to sound different, and your voice might be pitched slightly higher than mine or lower. That's natural to all of us. But usually when somebody has a really deep, rich voice, what we're really reacting to is not so much that they have an absolute pitch in their voice that's really low, but more that they have this relaxed, resonant tone. You will probably be surprised, even if you're a tenor, even if you have a high voice, you'll be surprised how manly you can sound and how easy you can sound if you just let go. If you just let the air into those resonators, and the way to do that is to make them as open as possible without straining or stretching them out. Well, how do you do that? So the resonators are in your chest, and that's why relaxing your shoulders is good. So if you have that relaxed shoulder posture, your chest's already kind of taken care of. But then they're also in your sinuses and in your head. And to open those up, you have to learn how to lift your soft palate. What is your soft palate? Your soft palate, and this is where we get into the part that it's like your tennis coach is telling you to rotate your wrists some tiny amount. But I promise if you work on this for a while, if you practice it and kind of think about it for a second, you will get it, and it will start to become like raising your eyebrows or spreading your toes, just something you can do. Your soft palate is the soft part on the roof of your mouth, behind the hard part. You have a hard palate, which is right behind your teeth, and then if you run your tongue back along that, you will eventually come to a part that's just kind of like muscle, fleshy part. And that's a very technical term, by the way, the fleshy bits, right, in at the top of your mouth. And that part is mobile because it's just muscular. And so you can raise it up. And sometimes it helps to raise your eyebrows, but your eyebrows are not connected to your soft palate. So what I like to do is I like to just say the letter K while breathing in. So if you think about the letter K, now say that in reverse, like while breathing air in, and go K. And when you hear that sound, that's partly your soft palate lifting up and opening up, and you're going to feel a lot more space kind of at the back of your throat, and you might eventually yawn, which is another thing that you can do, because yawning raises your soft palate too, and you need to learn to sit in that position, which again is not a hugely tense position. It's actually a position that's easy to be in, especially when you are speaking, but you want to be speaking into that open space. Think of yourself kind of letting the air flow out and through into that space like it's coming out of your forehead. And if you practice that, the diaphragm, the larynx, and the soft palette or the resonators for, I don't know, like 30 minutes a day is always my benchmark to get good at anything. But if you practice that every day, you're going to start to see stuff, and then you're going to stop thinking about it in the day, but you'll notice, gosh, I actually feel more relaxed, and I kind of sound pretty good. Like everything, the voice is not just the voice. Nothing is just itself. Everything is connected to everything else, and this is actually a huge tool that you don't want to sleep on, because there's all sorts of practical reasons why you can use it. Plus, it can be kind of fun. Singing is a whole different beast, and I'm such an amateur singer that I don't even want to try to tell you about how to do that. But basically, if you go into singing, singing is just sort of sustained speaking, and you're trying as much as possible to get out of the way and sustain that speech in a healthy way. But if you're talking, that's it. That's all you got to do. And then you will sound like the most interesting man in the world. Okay. All right. I'm so glad to be with you guys. Thank you for joining me. This was so much fun. I have to tell you, I'm having so much fun doing this. It's kind of becoming like the Dan Carlin history podcast of literature. We've sort of entered into this giant, sprawling series. And basically, I think I just want to kind of keep doing this for the rest of time, because this has been so wonderful to sit with this text for a long time. I am starting to think about what we're going to do next. We're not really up near the end of the Odyssey yet, but when we get there, I'd like to know from you if there are books that this would be helpful to do this with. It can be something we've already covered, because I covered a lot of stuff in one episode that we could expand out into these long series if you like. Write in and let me know. Again, at rejoiceevermore.substack.com. Tell the world, spread the word, let people know about this episode and about this show by linking to it wherever you share content. And I will see you next time for more truth, beauty, and the stuff that matters.